But it's just going to be an introduction to the Psalms. I'll do the first part, and Jim will do the second part. And what I thought we'd do is talk a little bit about authorship. I think most people hear about the Psalms of David, and they think David wrote them all. Well, that's probably not the case. He may not have written any of them. They may have been written for him, so they're his Psalms. That doesn't mean that he wrote them. So certainly the Davidic authorship of all of the Psalms cannot be maintained. Many of them were clearly written long after he was gone. They may have been composed before Israel and Judah went into captivity in the early part of the 7th century. But then after they came back from exile, collected and put into various, and adapted. We'll talk about that a little bit. But they were probably composed for use during the monarchy. And again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. So they weren't originally probably meant for any kind of congregational use, but for larger celebrations or observances or cultic festivals or royal festivals or seasonal festivals like that. And then as time went on, they were sort of adapted. So for example, a psalm of war for a king, gosh, there are all these people that are embattling me and all this kind of stuff, became sort of internalized, personalized for I'm under attack. So these things that were maybe originally written for a larger context were drawn back. Or a prisoner of war song then might have been sung by the exiles in Babylon. I'm beset and all of these kinds of things. That's because, I'm a prisoner of war. But no, now I'm in Babylon, which is not quite the same thing as a prisoner of war. So the authorship is not, there's hardly any way of kind of figuring it out. Why were they written? There were other folks, other countries, other nations, other peoples that were writing psalms. We have lots of examples of these. So Israel wasn't alone, but we know from our examples from other cultures that they would be written for state festivals. The anniversary of the enthronement of the king, big state festival, we write a psalm for that, right?
Kind of like the poetry that we had at an inauguration. When the national poet.
From the poet laureate or something like that. Yeah. Exactly. Or if you've got a tribal god and you re-enthrone the tribal god, maybe it's the god of harvest, so at the harvest time you re-enthrone, you write a psalm for that. So other cultures did that. You'll remember that Israel was made up of 12 tribes, loose confederation, right? Especially before the monarchy. Well, maybe annually they would come together and they would rededicate themselves to one another. A covenant renewal. So there would be a psalm written, or psalms written for covenant renewal. Agricultural festivals. Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of Booths, harvest and planting. Psalms written to celebrate and to invoke God's blessing on those enterprises. So there are a lot of different ways. The New Year, it's funny, I guess I haven't seen him for a long time, so I assume he's still my friend. A rabbinical colleague, he was an Orthodox, very Orthodox colleague, and I noticed I was reading something in the Hebrew Bible, and it said, well, this is the New Year. And then about 3 weeks later, I read something else in another part. And said, well, this is the New Year. But there were two different ones. And I said, how many New Years do you have? And he says, it depends on what you're looking at. So there's the New Year in the fall, and there's a New Year at another point, and a New Year at another point. But all those New Years, whether it's agricultural or something else, might have deserved songs.
And we have Advent, we have January 1st.
Right. That's right.
Beginning of the academic year.
That's right. We have all of these New Years too. And then, the Jerusalem cult. So the king and then all the priests and all of that, the renewing of the cultic work would have been or could have been an occasion for the writing of songs. So all of these were done, and we see echoes of all of them in other cultures, but also in the Book of Psalms as we have it. So what does it look like? And we don't see this so much in the prayer book. This is where the prayer book and the editors of the prayer book made some decisions, because these were going to be used in either private or public worship, not something else. So there are some places where they've renumbered, not the Psalms, but the verses don't quite track exactly with the way that you might find them in the Bible. But they also leave off a lot of the headings. There aren't basically any headings in the Psalms in the Book of Common Prayer. But if you look in the Bible, you'll see a lot of headings. And one of them might be for this group of people, and I'll get to that. Or it might say, sung to the tune of, oh, Susanna. And you see those, that it gives musical instruction. We don't have that written in the Psalms, in the prayer book. So, but there is a shape of the collection in the Bible, and that is there's some reflection of that in the prayer book. There are what are considered 5 books of Psalms. And each one ends with a doxology. And we'll probably see that, given some of the Psalms that any of the 3 of us choose. One of them might be the last one in that collection. And then there will be a doxology. And then in the prayer book, you'll see a line below that in bold print, book 3. And then you'll move to the next collection. So book 1 is basically Psalms 2 through 41. And the preferred name for God, this is how you can tell the preferred name for God, you would see this in Hebrew, not in English, is Yahweh. Okay? Book 2, Psalms 42 to 72, these are Psalms of David. So these might have been ones that could have, either they were attributed to him or presented to him or something like this. The preferred name for God is Elohim, which is kind of a generic Hebrew word for God. Actually, it's plural, gods, but that tends to mean the God. And then, but within Psalms 42 to 72 is a selection, 42 to 50, which were the Psalms of the Korahites. Now, we don't really know much about them. They may have been a guild. They may have been a guild of singers. We don't know a heck of a lot about the Korahites. But they're on the inscription, you'll see for the Korahites, or for the sons of Korah, or something like that, depending on the translation. So that's part of Psalms 42 to 72. Then we get into Psalms 73 to 89, and this is a kind of interesting little book, considered the Psalms of Asaph. Who's Asaph? Again, we don't know. He might have been the choir director. He could have been a chief priest at the time. We don't know anything.
As soon as possible,
Yes.
Let's get the service over with.
And so in this collection, Psalms 73 to 83 are the Psalms of Asaph. And then they threw in a few more. So there are 4 Korahite Psalms, there's a Davidic Psalm, and one attributed to Ethan the Ezrahite. Don't know who these people are or were. But that's part of the inscription. And again, some of these might have that, it's for the sons of Korah, sung to the tune of, weeping daisies. I mean, it's funny to look at the names of these tunes. Some of them are pretty humorous. Then we get to book 5, miscellaneous Psalms. That's just what they are. There's nothing that's particularly, there's no binding feature to them. And book 5 is yet another set of miscellaneous Psalms. But in book 5, 107 to 149, there are 3 Psalms that are give thanks Psalms. They sort of begin with give thanks. Then there are these Psalms 111 to 113 and 146 to 150 that are called the Hallel Psalms. That word Hallel is the root from hallelujah, let us praise God. So these are praise psalms. And then within this last collection of 14 Book 5 are what are known as the Psalms of Ascent, also often called the pilgrimage psalms, and we'll get to those. These might have been the psalms that people sang on their way on an annual pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They may have been sung once they got into Jerusalem and were maybe ascending the steps to the temple. Okay, so these are the Psalms of Ascent. So these were collected, and then Psalm 1 is an introduction psalm, and Psalm 150 is the other bookend. So they act independently, really, of those others, although they'll be included in Book 1 or Book 5. How did all of this come together? Well, scholars think that they were all independent, preserved for use in the temple or for festivals, as we said. And then small collections might be made and were used for rituals. So a collection might be made for use at Passover. A collection might be used for the Enthronement Festival. And then they were combined. And scholars would say that the first four collections were made for the first edition, those first 4 books, the Psalter first edition. And then that edition was enlarged by that, if we go back, Psalms 84 to 89 were added. And then Psalms 90 to 149 were added. And then Psalm 1 and Psalm 150. So it developed over the course of time. And probably a lot of this was done while they were in Babylon, so that when they came back, they had this full psalter, this full group of psalms. How were they used? Liturgical, they were meant to be sung. I think all 3 of us will talk about this over and over again, that they were meant to be sung. And so the Levites, the priests and the Levites, well, the priests were doing the sacrificial stuff, and the Levites were taking care of all of the other stuff, like music, and, so the Levites had a role in this, and maybe that was part of it. Like I say, a lot of times they might have been addressed to the director of music, again, along with the melodies, O Susanna, or something like that. Not many of them have that. I would say probably 20 or 25 have a musical tune that's included. Then they became used in the church. You'll remember places in the New Testament sort of encourage one another with psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. Here are the psalms being used in New Testament Christian worship. Then they became a mainstay in monastic worship, again, where they were chanted. And we have lots of examples of those chants. And the chants varied from different parts of the world. So in the West, we think about Gregorian chant. But there are certainly other kinds of chant in other parts of the Christian world. And so they were translated into that. And the Reformation changed some things. Of course, chants developed as music developed from the single line to polyphony. And the Reformation changed things because not everybody was in a monastery. And so, along with the advent of polyphony, they begin to be set as hymns. All right? So, we can think of all people that on earth do dwell, sing to the Lord with cheer. That's just Psalm 100, set to a chant. Because there was a belief among some Christians that you shouldn't sing anything that wasn't biblical. So you would sing it and turn it into something that the whole congregation could sing. In the Church of England, over the course of starting in the 16th and 17th century, there would be a chant, but it would be turned into 4-part chant, and what's known as Anglican chant. And we've got some examples of that I can play when we're done. If we have time, we can come back to that. And then there are newer forms. And I remember when the new hymnal, 1982, when the 40-year-old hymnal was being developed, there was a lot of conversation about what kind of psalms should we include, or psalm singing tunes should we include in that hymnal. And basically what we chose to include was Anglican chant and Gregorian chant. We don't have many examples of anything else, but there were, in that period of liturgical renewal in the late 60s and into the 70s, there were a lot of other forms of chant. And I've got some examples queued up if you want to listen to those. And sometimes if you go to the cathedral or if you go to some other churches, you'll see a chant that will be called the Portland Psalter. And that was developed in a church in Portland, Oregon. It gets published by the Oregon Catholic Press. But it was another way for a congregation and a choir to join together in singing. So sort of the congregation would sing the refrain, and then the choir would sing the verses. So there are other ways of chant. But the Psalms were really meant to be sung. And we don't sing them very often. And so it's at least not at Good Shepherd. A lot of other churches do a lot more Psalms than we do. So I'm going to stop. I've got 3 minutes to answer questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Jim for his part. Like I said, I've got selections of all of these varieties of Psalms recorded already, so we can look at those if we want, or we may run out of time. So any questions for this very quick overview of the formation? Yeah.
I'm curious as to, I noticed in the prayer book that most of the Psalms start with some Latin phrase.
Okay.
And I have no idea what it's like. I have to go to Google Translate to figure out what it is. Was this a stylistic thing, or why did they do that?
Well, it's usually the first 2 or 3 words of the Psalm in Latin.
Oh,
And so coming out of the monastic heritage,
yeah.
when we started doing things in English, still a lot of the monasteries in England were still doing things in Latin, and so it just sort of came over. But a lot of times, if you think about the 2 Psalms that we use regularly in morning prayer, Psalm 96 and Psalm 100, come, let us worship. In Latin, it would be venite, like, oh, come, let us adore. Venite, adore, and then the other one, sing with joy, would be jubilate.
Oh, I see.
Okay, but Anglicans do their own thing, and so we call it the Venite and the Jubilate. It's just because So, but that's a really good question. Really good question. Others?
Do we still know the original tunes that those were written on?
No, that's a good question. We have texts in Hebrew that go back quite a ways, and there's so much marking on the texts on Hebrew, because Hebrew is written without vowels. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes what they call the extracritical or diacritical marks tell you what vowels are supposed to be used here. Sometimes they may have been indications on how it was supposed to be sung, but we don't know what they mean. Does a downward curve mean that you're supposed to go, oh, or does it mean something else? We don't know what it means, and where do you start? So there are some scholars who've tried to reconstruct some of that. And some would say, well, it's supposed to sound a whole lot like, Arabic chant and things like that, but we don't know. And so most of it's reconstruction. All right, I'm going to turn this off so we have at least the shared part.
I am surprised by the number of us. I only made 20 copies of this, and I think there are more than 20 of us here. So if you're sitting beside someone that you're willing to share a copy with, please do that, and pass the remaining ones along. What I'm about to do is talk about the structure of Hebrew poetry. And I want to say at the outset that just about everything I'm going to say today you can forget. The reason I want to say it is that my own experience with the Psalms, and perhaps yours has been the same, that clearly these are poems. But they don't look like any poetry I've ever seen before. The lines don't rhyme, they're not a metered length, they don't fall into standard stanzas the way we're accustomed to seeing. Hebrew poetry has its own structure, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. And I think when I first came to understand that, these Psalms just opened up to me. And so bear with me, and as I say, The whole purpose of this is only to give you a key to understanding what's going on as these psalms move from line to line. And I need to confess that I had signed up for Hebrew during my seminary course, but due to a family emergency, the instructor had to take an emergency sabbatical. So I have not taken Hebrew, and if I get into too much trouble, I want you to run away. And just make it look as though I know what I'm talking about. The Psalms in the Hebrew text are not laid out in poetic lines as they are in our prayer book or in our Bible translations. My understanding is that they're just all mushed together. And so as translators come to look at these Psalms, they need to look at the meaning of the words and the structure of the words as they appear one beside another in order to understand what constitutes a single line. Because my understanding is Hebrew just began writing from right to left, and when you ran out of space, then you went down and started over, and the lines were just mushed in there together. So as we read translations, we will oftentimes discover that one particular translation may break out lines a little differently than another translation does. And actually on the, I think my notes have a 4.5. On the back of, I've printed two copies of Psalm number 1. The one is the current prayer book translation. The one on the reverse that has the Elgar chant tune above it is from our 28 prayer book, which is actually comes from the 1662 and earlier English prayer books. And you'll even notice between those two translations that some of the stanzas have different numbers of lines in them. So there's not a correct way of looking at these. The best you can do is go learn Hebrew and then look at these mushed up texts and make your own decision. Having said that, there was a worthy Anglican bishop in the 18th century, his name was Robert Laut, who looked at these texts and discovered that there was a parallelism in the meaning, that words would more or less parallel each other. And he said, aha, those are two different lines and they're in parallel. And subsequent scholars took his work and refined it so that we not only had sympathetic parallelism, which meant that the two lines really said the same thing a little differently, to oppositional parallelism, in which I had a heavy night last night, where the lines were sort of opposite to each other, and they defined all different kinds of parallelism. But parallelism is the basic structure of Hebrew poetry. So if you look at Psalm 1, on the side of the page that does not have the musical staff on the top of it, look at stanza 2. This is the basic structure of Hebrew poetry. Two lines that are parallel in structure and in meaning. Their delight is in the law of the Lord. They meditate on his law day and night. The antecedent is the happy ones that we're introduced to in line 1. But look at that carefully. If you have a pencil, if not, just imagine it. In the first line of stanza 2, after the word delight, put a hash mark, and after the word law, put a hash mark. Line 2, After meditate, put a hash mark, and after law, put a hash mark. Now what we have are two lines, each of which has 3 metrical beats. Delight, and a beat is not measured in syllables the way it is in English poetry, but in thought units. So delight, law, Lord, meditate, law, night. So what happens in this typical Hebrew line of poetry is that you've got these 3 beats, and they're more or less parallel. Their delight is in the law of the Lord. They meditate on his law day and night. But like all poetic forms, poems get boring if it's just the same rhyme and meter over and over again. I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree. So poets begin to vary the pattern. And just looking at the physical shape of this, the editors of our current prayer book said, well, you know, we look at these mushed up words, but these 3 lines appear to be a unit. And so some lines are more than, or some stanzas are more than 2 lines, they're 3 lines. Occasionally you'll find a 4-line stanza. Then this whole business of parallelism got so specific that it was just incredibly technical. But a scholar named Robert Alter began to look at these and says, you know, the idea of parallelism is appropriate, but let's forget about trying to define the various different kinds of parallelism and just say that as these lines go from line to line, ask yourself the question, what new is happening in this line that didn't happen in the previous line? The poet is telling us something additional, something new. So if you look at line 2, their delight is in the law of the Lord, and then it becomes more specific. He tells us something about the character of that delight. They meditate on the law. So it's not just being happy and kind of, gosh, the law is pretty and beautiful. I like to sort of contemplate it, but I meditate on it. And actually, one of the reasons I put the other translation on the back is that, as you know, any word can have multiple meanings, true of Hebrew words as well. And an appropriate meaning for what is rendered as meditate in one translation is rendered, his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he will exercise himself day and night. So this is a much more active engagement with the law than simply delighting in it. So Alter would say, okay, understand that these poetic lines are in parallel, but they're not simply supposed to be a repetition, one of the other, but with each line something new is being added. So ask yourself, as you go from line to line, what new is going on here? So let's just read through Psalm 1. I love this psalm. How much time do I have?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. I'll hurry. I think this is a spectacular psalm. So let's start.
Remember, can I just interrupt?
No.
Remember, this song was added as the introduction to the entire psalter.
That was my line at the end. I told you we should have talked about this. read the song. Read the song.
Some of us will forget and be surprised.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, well, that's my age. age that forgets. You think I remember all this? Look at these notes on that piece of paper. Happy are they who have not walked in the counsel of the wicked, nor lingered in the way of sinners, nor sat in the seats of the scornful. Look what's going on in these 3 lines. Happy, most of the contemporary translations now translate that as happy. It's good to know that the earlier translations translated that first word, blessed or blessed are they. Happy to me may be an appropriate translation, but it seems a little superficial, something deeply profound.
Happy clappy.
Yeah, well, that's what I don't want it to be happy clapping. But somehow a deep alignment of one's spirit or one's soul with the divine is a blessedness, that's happiness. So, happy are they who have not walked in the counsel of the wicked. Okay, we get to the next line, nor lingered in the way of sinners. So imagine drawing a line from walked to lingered and from wicked to sinners, and look what happens. First, you're simply kind of walking along. It's as though you meet someone on a path and you walk with them for a little bit. There's some engagement. You talk a little bit. But now you're lingering with them. That is a more intense engagement and relationship than simply walking with one another. So let a red warning flag go up. You know, the unhappy ones are ones who started just a casual sort of relationship with the wicked, but now they're hanging out with the wicked. And look at what's happened to the wicked. Now they are sinners. They are actively being wicked. So there's a progression that the poet wants us, you know, this happens kind of subliminally as we read the Psalms. I'm not sure I always pay attention and articulate this, but somehow as you read it, something inside you tells you that, the water's getting deeper here. And all of a sudden you're sitting in the seats of the scornful. So now you're really keeping counsel with them. You're not just walking with them or hanging out with them. You are keeping counsel with them. And look at what's happened to the wicked. They are now scornful. They are the mockers of the keepers of the law. And so in this first line, he has plunged us, down to the depths. And we get a view of sort of the slippery path that your soul can get on if you just sort of, walk with the wicked, and all of a sudden you're hanging out with them, and all of a sudden you're keeping counsel. But by contrast, the happy, the blessed, their delight is in the law of the Lord. They're not mocking the Lord or scorning the law. Their delight is in it, and more than that, they meditate on it, or they exercise themselves in it. They actually try to form their lives in the same shape as the law. A word about law, Torah. I need a Hebrew scholar to help me out here. Paul, I think, rails against the law so much that it tends to make us a little bristly when we find the word law. Law really means instruction. It's showing the way. Law was God's self-revelation of God's own nature. And that can easily be summarized in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. It is an act of grace. And so those who delight in the law and meditate on the law are ones who accept the instruction and want to engage it. And they are like trees planted by streams of water. I love that image. All you have to do is drive out on the plains and you see these cottonwoods following the water courses and everything else is barren and dry and ugly. But those who delight in the law, God's instruction, are like trees planted by streams of water, bearing fruit. They actually leave the world with more good than was in the world before they came. And they have leaves that do not wither. Those are metaphors, but in the third line of this stanza, the poet really doubles down and he says, everything they do shall prosper. Something profoundly good happens to those who delight in the law of the Lord. And prosper, it seems to me here, does not mean they have more sheep in their flock or their stock returns go up. I think it has something to do with their soul.
Flourishing, maybe. Flourishing.
Yeah, something good is going on. It is not so with the wicked. They are like the chaff which the wind blows away, dry, dusty, just as it's immaterial, it just puffs. So while trees are rooted deeply and bear good fruit and leaves, the wicked are just like this dusty chaff that blows this way and that and eventually is dissipated. Therefore the wicked shall not stand upright when the judgment comes, nor the sinner in the counsel of the unrighteous. The poet now evokes some of those images from earlier in the Psalms, sat in the seat of the scornful. He's making the contrast between the good guys and the bad guys. For the Lord knows, I think it's the New English Bible says, the Lord watches over the way of the righteous. No, now I read commentaries, I don't read Hebrew, but the word, I think the Hebrew word for know is a word which can be as intimate as sexual know. So the Lord knows us profoundly intimately, knows the righteous in a profoundly intimate way, but the way of the wicked is doomed. As Gary said, this is the first psalm. It's kind of intended to be the introduction to the whole collection. And my sense is that it also, it's kind of a spoiler. It tells you what the arc of the sense of the whole collection is going to be. And that is that the good guys win and the bad guys lose. But you will argue, wait a minute, I look around the world and I don't see that happening. I see good guys taking it in the neck all the time and bad guys prospering. As we move through the summer, we're going to look at some of the Psalms which are called the Lamentations, read complaints or griping. And we'll find that in the collection, about a third, 49 out of the 150 Psalms, are these complaints, these laments, when the psalmist says, everything's going badly. I've been a good guy from the very beginning, and I take it in the neck all the time. What's going on here? So I would say, as it was then, so it is now. And so I think one good question that we can raise and attend to as we go through the selection of the Psalms is, how does the biblical view measure what a good guy is, and how does the biblical view measure what a bad guy is? does being a good guy mean being rewarded with lots of sheep in your flock and a burgeoning stock portfolio? Is that what prospering is in the view of these Psalms? Or is it, or what is it? And what constitutes a bad guy? I think that's one of the questions before us as we enter.
I was just gonna say, we've got queued up the Elgar. I've got the Elgar Anglican chant, the one that you have printed here. If you wanted to hang for a couple more minutes and just listen to that. I didn't bring in any external speakers, so it's gonna be the speakers coming out of the computer. So.
And if you can hear the words, this is the 1662 prayer book in England, which is similar to the reverse of the sheet we've been looking at, the one with the music staff on top.
Gary, is this the Elgar that wrote the Enigma variations?
Right?
Yes.
This is,
Yeah, same one. Oh, what happened to my sound?
I told you should have let me brought my boombox.
Your boombox. Boomboxes never fail.
They never fail.
Never fail. No. Is that the Gloria at the end?
Yeah. We're,
Traditionally, when Christians use the Psalms or sing them, they conclude with the Gloria Patri, Gloria to the Father, Son, Holy Ghost, or Holy Spirit, to kind of Christianize the Psalm. I sort of, when I read it privately, I don't do that because I like the Hebrew to have its own integrity. But among the many battles that were fought over the revision of the Book of Common Prayer, and there were many, as many of you remember, in 1979, was the translation of the Psalter. Because you had this rich tradition of Anglican chant and this beautiful language. The Coverdale Psalter came out of the Coverdale Bible in the 16th century, and we maintained it pretty consistently all the way through to the 1928 edition. And so the revisers had a heck of a job because they were trying to render it in more understandable English. certain nod toward inclusive language, although it was still early in our history for that to be fully developed. But there's some of that in the Psalms. They tried to be more inclusive as to gender and that kind of thing. And happy and blessed is an example, and sometimes it weakens it, I think. Rumor is that W.H. Auden, who was a famous poet, was part of the original revision team, and he got so furious at the revision, especially blessed and happy, and a phrase called the grip of the grave, he just couldn't take it. He walked out of the meeting altogether. He just thought that was too tacky for words and didn't have the richness of the 16th century English, which I sort of sympathize with, and sometimes I read my office out of the 28 prayer book just because I love the language of the Psalms particularly. But to use them in worship, understandability is the point. And so I think that revisers did a pretty good job. They also had to write them or translate them, update them in such a way that they could be sung and chanted. And so they had a big job.
So next week, if you didn't grab a copy of the syllabus, we'll talk about royal psalms. I drew the short stick on that one. And you'll see the ones that we'll be looking at. Feel free to look at them in the prayer book. Feel free to look at them in any translation that you have. Because I think if you come in with a different translation of what we're used to hearing in the prayer book, there are 150 psalms, and I'll maybe next week I'll bring in the number of psalms that we never say in public worship. And there are many of them that we use over and over and over again, like Psalm 23. But there are many of them that we never use. And so, all of this is part of this conversation. It's why are we not using this one? Well, maybe somebody else says the same thing, just a little more poetically. Or we don't want to talk about that one because it's going to create problems that the preacher is going to have to deal with. But we're looking for translations because it's good to hear them in different ways. And I'll make us at least one slide, because I think through slides now, that will show the mashup of the Hebrew text, what it looks like in a normal Hebrew text now, just so you can see how different that is, and some of the songs we'll look at. And over the course of the summer, so we heard Anglican chant, we'll probably hear Anglican chant again sometime. We'll hear other versions of music, we may even sing some. Yeah, we may even sing some. So whether it's Gregorian or whether it's some of these other kinds of things, it's I think it will be a rich summer. So thank you all for joining us. And
Hi, these books are from our library, and they're on the Psalms, and mostly from C.S. Lewis, who's got an interesting perspective on the Psalms, worth having a look at. One of them is specifically on Psalm 23. But if you want to take one today and have them for the summer, and just bring them back and put them on that cart when you're finished. So I'll just plonk them there and feel free, because they're everybody's.
Thank you.
Right?
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, as a former English teacher, reading specialist, doctorate of education, 1622 was Shakespearean modern English. So those of us who learned to read the Bible, King James Version, had no problem in Shakespeare class. But it's that sonnet, and the parallel is noun, the verb, and tense are the same all the way through. So when they're repeated, it's the same structure, which is syntax. Subject, verb, object, or modifiers, and that's what it means. And of course, the best uses of parallelism today happen to be Black preachers. They do a great job.
When I was